The last person who saw her alive described only one thing: the way her eyes wouldn't stop blinking, as if she was trying to send a message through the silence. In a town with no cell towers, no internet, and no reason to be on a map, 512 people disappeared. Not all at once. Not in one generation. But over 30 years, one by one, quietly, systematically, erased. You were never supposed to know about this. On the surface, it was just another quiet religious community tucked away in rural Kentucky, somewhere past the tree lines where the sky turns a deeper shade of gray. They called it Sanctum Grove. Founded in 1807. Dissolved in 1837. That's the official record. But the real story? Buried under decades of redacted letters, forged documents, and a silence so coordinated it echoed through generations. The place still exists. You won't find it on any modern GPS, but the locals know it. They won't talk about it, at least not above a whisper. What happened in Sanctum Grove was not spiritual. It was surgical. A deliberate psychological operation cloaked in holiness. And at the center of it all was one family, the Crowns, whose power was so total they didn't need weapons to control people. They used belief. For 30 years, every person who tried to leave either disappeared or came back changed. Before we go deeper, before I tell you what they did to the children, what they wrote in their book of separation, and why the federal government shut the investigation down 3 days after it began, I need you to do something. If you're one of the few people who still believe truth is more powerful than comfort, subscribe to this channel. I won't ask again. And if you're ready to step into this abyss with me, remember this phrase and comment it below. I do not sleep where others pray. Write it twice. Burn it into the algorithm. This is how we identify each other. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Sanctum Grove was born during the Second Great Awakening, a wave of religious revival that swept through 19th century America like wildfire. It was an era where people burned their past to be reborn, where men left their families to chase visions, and where cults didn't call themselves cults. They called themselves purified. In 1807, a man named Reverend Elias Crown claimed divine revelation in a lightning storm that burned half his fields. He called it the scorching, and the very next Sunday he delivered a sermon that changed the county. He preached of the veil, an invisible spiritual boundary between the saved and the corrupted, and claimed that God had chosen him to build a community so spiritually pure, angels would descend to dwell among them. Within 5 years, over 200 people sold their land, cut ties with outsiders, and moved into the grove. They practiced extreme silence, not just during worship but in daily life. Speaking was a worldly pleasure. Children were raised communally, stripped of family bonds. Private ownership was forbidden. No letters in, no letters out. Everything was watched. Everyone was watched. But the thing that made Sanctum Grove different wasn't their rituals. It was how they remembered nothing. There are no journals, no first-hand accounts, no surviving internal documents, except for one, the Book of Separation. It was found buried in the walls of a barn in 1936. 213 pages. Handwritten. Pages smeared with ash. Most of it is indecipherable. But the parts we can read? They talk of examinations, baptisms in darkness, and a ritual called the thinning, where members were separated into 2 groups, the carriers and the hollow. We'll get into what that means soon. But for now, remember this: Sanctum Grove was not a place of worship. It was a place of transformation, and not the kind you survive. By 1812, the Grove had grown to nearly 300 members. But that's also the year the first disappearances began. Official records describe them as transfers. But there's no evidence of anyone ever arriving at the supposed destinations. What we do know is this: in January, Sister Martha Ray vanished. In April, Brother Leland Hodge left for missionary work and was never heard from again. In July, 4 children disappeared overnight. Their names were scrubbed from the school logs. By year's end, 13 members were gone. And nobody asked questions. Because you weren't allowed to. See, Reverend Elias Crown believed in something he called the Great Shearing, a divine cleansing where God periodically removed the unworthy from the flock. And if someone vanished, it was considered a blessing. You didn't grieve. You praised. This doctrine created a form of psychological submission so deep, even the parents of missing children would stand and sing hymns the next morning. Let me be clear, this wasn't brainwashing. It was identity erasure. They rebuilt you from scratch. They fed you guilt, took your name, and rewrote your memories under something called the Veil Protocol, a series of spiritual tests conducted in complete sensory deprivation. Some were left in darkness for days. Others were made to dig their own symbolic graves to bury the old self. And some never came back at all. There were no sermons about heaven. Only purity. Only obedience. They didn't want followers. They wanted instruments. And in that silence, in that total lack of self, the Crown family began their real work. The Crowns weren't pastors. They were engineers of the mind. Reverend Elias was just the face. Behind him stood his brother Judah Crown, a man with a background in medicine and a fascination with neurological control. He was obsessed with the idea that thoughts could be disrupted by ritual, that repeated behaviors, sleep deprivation, and controlled language could rewire entire identities. In his journal, the only one that survived, he wrote, "Language is the leash. Take it and they howl. Remove it and they follow." Judah ran what they called the Quiet House. It was a white, windowless building at the edge of the grove, surrounded by prayer stones and silence. New converts spent 21 days there. No speaking. No clocks. No human contact. Only chanting, played through walls by a hidden pipe system. Some called it holy. Others left it broken. One woman, Sister Delia Monroe, escaped after just 5 days. She was found naked and babbling in a cornfield 7 miles away. She couldn't speak English anymore. Only the chants. She died 2 weeks later. Locals say her mouth never fully closed again, as if she was still trying to say something that her mind couldn't process. The Crowns used that story, twisted it, said she'd seen heaven, said she'd chosen to remain spiritually open. And just like that, the legend of the Blessed Silent was born. Men and women were now volunteering to disappear. By 1820, the disappearances became routine. 1 every month. Sometimes 2. Some ascended, others were reborn under new names. But the truth? They were being tested, broken, filtered. Those who didn't comply? They were removed. The Crowns created a system called the separation ladder, a caste system of holiness. At the top, the watchers. Below them, the carriers. Below them, the learners. At the bottom, the hollow. The hollow were new arrivals, considered spiritually empty. They weren't allowed to speak, sleep on beds, or even make eye contact with higher ranks. The watchers. They lived underground. Literally. In chambers beneath the chapel, accessed by a staircase sealed after the community was disbanded. They were the ones who saw through the veil. No one knows exactly what they did down there. But one account, from a defector named Josiah Trent, described sound experiments, mirror rituals, and something he called the reversal prayer. He claimed it made him forget his wife's face. Trent later killed himself in a public square in 1841, carving "I remember nothing" into his chest with a shard of glass. That phrase would later appear in FBI files from the 1950s. But we'll get to that. In 1821, a federal census worker named Silas Kane attempted to document Sanctum Grove. What he found never made it to the official records. His notes, confiscated and hidden in a locked cabinet until 1964, describe a place where the air itself felt instructed to lie. He was greeted by a woman who refused to give her name, only calling herself a vessel of light. She insisted he leave his horse at the entrance and follow her on foot. The walk was 2 miles through pine-covered trails that twisted unnaturally, as if designed to disorient. When he arrived, he noted that every home looked exactly the same. Whitewashed wood, small windows, no chimneys. No sound except the wind and the occasional rhythmic hum, low and pulsing like it came from underground. Silas asked for a meeting with the leader. Instead, he was brought to a small room and told to wait for cleansing. For 3 hours, he sat alone in total darkness, until he began to hear voices, whispers reciting what sounded like a prayer loop. He later wrote, the words weren't in English. Or maybe they were. But they changed shape every time I listened. When the door opened, a man stood there. Elias Crown. He was taller than expected. Skin like stretched paper. His eyes didn't blink once during the entire conversation. Crown refused to provide names, birth counts, or any other details required by law. When Silas insisted, the Reverend leaned in and whispered, "We are not under time. We do not age here. We are not counted." The next morning, Silas left before sunrise, shaking uncontrollably. He tried to report what he'd seen. 3 days later he resigned. His family said he never spoke of that visit again. But 20 years later, his grandson, Benjamin Kane, became part of the U.S. Marshals exploratory team sent to investigate the grove's shutdown. His notes? Missing. His body? Found hung in a barn near Harrodsburg with a note in his pocket that simply read, "The veil is never lifted, only traded." By 1825, the U.S. government had received over a dozen anonymous letters, most from former members or distant relatives, raising concerns about the grove. Claims of psychological abuse, missing persons, and forbidden rituals. But every investigation was halted. Why? Because on paper, Sanctum Grove was flawless. They paid taxes. They ran a profitable seed business. They exported hand-carved furniture to Ohio and Pennsylvania. Everything matched. Receipts, ledgers, birth and death records. Clean. Too clean. The truth? Those records were fabricated by Sister Miriam Crown, Elias's niece. She had a gift for forgery, capable of mimicking handwriting after seeing just a few pages. She'd studied law before joining the community. When she converted, she burned her degree in a ritual fire. Her skills, however, were preserved and weaponized. She created entire identities, whole families that never existed, death certificates for people who were still breathing, and birth records for children never born. But the real horror? The letters she forged to families on the outside. Loving, faith-filled messages written by sons and daughters long since buried behind the chapel. These letters arrived monthly. Warm, detailed, emotionally persuasive. Families believed their loved ones were thriving. Meanwhile, the grove's inner sanctum tightened its grip. Once a year, a culling was held, disguised as a fasting retreat. Members were evaluated. Those who showed resistance, hesitation, or nostalgia for the outside world were lifted, which is to say, removed. Their belongings burned. Their names reassigned. Their voices silenced. Over 30 years, the outside world never noticed the drop. Because every exit had a paper trail. Every death had a signature. And every person who vanished had already been replaced in the ledger by someone else. The grove became a loop. An engine of belief-fueled vanishing. Until one woman disrupted everything. Her name was Rebecca Talwin. She arrived in 1826 after surviving a riverboat fire that killed her family. Scarred, mute, and presumed mentally disabled, she was accepted as a spiritual blank slate. The Crowns called her a gift, an empty cup to be filled. But Rebecca was watching, listening, pretending. For 6 years she learned the system. She obeyed the fasting, passed every veil protocol. She was promoted to carrier in 1830, a mid-tier rank responsible for delivering messages between members. That's when she started copying them. By candlelight, under her floorboards, she wrote everything she saw. Letters, ritual schedules, maps of tunnels beneath the chapel. She kept them hidden in a hollow beam. She also learned about the Book of Separation, a ledger kept by Elias himself. It contained the names of every person ever lifted, along with their sins, their evaluations, and what was done to them. Rebecca's plan was simple: survive long enough to escape, then expose them all. But in 1833 she was caught copying a sermon in the quiet house. She was brought before Elias. His punishment was unique. She was declared unclean, forbidden from speaking, touching, or being acknowledged by others. For 9 months she lived among them as a ghost, watched, ignored, starving. But what the Crowns didn't know was that Rebecca had hidden her writings. And she wasn't alone. 2 other carriers, brothers Abram and Nolan, had seen what was happening. They'd been preparing an escape for over a year. That plan was about to activate. On February 3, 1834, just after midnight, Rebecca, Abram, and Nolan broke into the seed barn. That barn was a front, used to transport members marked for removal. Hidden under the seed sacks were hollow compartments lined in wool. They'd watched the patterns, knew the rotation schedule. This night, no patrols. They climbed in. Nolan brought the book. Rebecca had her letters. They waited. At dawn, Brother Isaac, a trusted watcher, loaded the wagon for a supposed delivery to Harrodsburg. It wasn't until he reached the fork in the road that he noticed the false floor had been opened. Rebecca hit him with a fire poker. Isaac survived, but he never returned to the grove. The three escapees reached a town called Millersburg by sundown. Nolan went to the sheriff's office. Abram brought the book to a church elder who had once visited the grove. Rebecca collapsed. Her body had deteriorated from years of deprivation. She died 2 days later. Her last words, written in shaking script, were, "There is no veil, only shadows pretending to be light." The sheriff filed a report. The elders sent letters. Within a week, U.S. Marshals were dispatched. But when they arrived at Sanctum Grove on February 17th, the community was gone. Buildings stood. Fires were lit. Food was warm. But no one was there. No bodies. No signs of struggle. Only the sound of wind and that low hum, still coming from underground. In the chapel basement, investigators found ritual tools. Ropes. A mirror wall. A pit of ashes with 200 charred name tags. And in the reverend's quarters, a single phrase carved into the wall. "We've stepped through. You're next." The case was immediately sealed. The surviving marshals were reassigned. The Book of Separation vanished into federal archives under a classification tag, Omega 17. No further public inquiries were allowed. The site was declared contaminated, and the surrounding woods were bought by a private foundation, linked to a holding company tied to a now-defunct religious trust. But rumors never died. In 1936, a group of local teens stumbled onto the old seed barn. Under one of the rotted floorboards, they found a bundle of pages wrapped in cloth, Rebecca's letters. Most were illegible, but one had a map, a spiral-shaped diagram with names, dates, and a final note that read, "The cycle repeats. Every 108 years. They move west." That same year, 2 children disappeared from a nearby farm. Their bodies were never found. And the Crown family? The name shows up again in California land records in 1939. Then in Oregon. Then gone. But the Watchers never wanted you to focus on one place. This was never about Sanctum Grove alone. It was about a method. A blueprint. A system for hiding evil in plain sight. And now that you know what happened in Kentucky, the real question is, where did they go next? After Sanctum Grove was abandoned, government surveyors were sent in under the guise of land redevelopment. Their mission wasn't public knowledge. Their reports were never released. But in 1962, a retired U.S. Geological Survey cartographer, Alvin Dorsey, leaked a portion of the maps. What he revealed stunned researchers. Beneath the grove were 7 tunnel systems, each branching out in precise geometric alignment. One ran directly under the chapel. Another, twice as long, reached past the county line. But the most disturbing was a shaft descending straight downward, over 180 feet, with no known endpoint. The tunnels weren't random. They mirrored the layout of a sacred symbol found in Mesopotamian ziggurats, an ancient diagram known as the binding wheel. What was a 4,000-year-old Sumerian structure doing replicated under a 19th-century Kentucky religious commune? That question triggered a brief investigation by the Smithsonian, which quietly dropped the matter months later. But Alvin wasn't done. He cross-referenced the grove structure with similar abandoned communities across North America. In each, he found repeating markers, hidden tunnels, spiral carvings, and vanishing populations. One in Missouri. One in upstate New York. One in Idaho. His conclusion? Sanctum Grove wasn't unique. It was a template, one of many. He gave it a name, the pattern of absence. Before he died in 1974, he issued one final warning in a private interview. They never disappeared. They perfected a ritual, a cycle, and they don't need land anymore. They need minds, minds willing to forget. So what happened to the Book of Separation? That ledger of names, dates, rituals, and disappearances? Rumor places it in the hands of Project Oscurus, a Cold War-era black program focused on psychological control systems. Former CIA operative Calvin Burns claimed in 1987 that the book had been used during MKUltra trials as an experimental template for engineered identity breakdown. According to Burns, the rituals described in the book weren't just religious. They were neurological scripts, precise sequences of deprivation, repetition, and trauma that could erase resistance and replace it with obedience. Sanctum Grove didn't just disappear, it was harvested for its methods. Methods that were modernized, scaled, and deployed in more covert forms. Schools, asylums, military units. According to declassified testimony, portions of the book were translated into psychological testing modules still in use today. That's why the book had to vanish. Not because it was a record of death, but because it was a manual for control. It described the exact moment when the human soul breaks, and how to rebuild it under command. A system of control so old it predated written history. Elias Crown didn't invent it. He inherited it, carried it like a torch passed through bloodlines. And if you're wondering why you've never heard of any of this, consider what else disappears when the system decides you're not meant to remember. Some say Sanctum Grove still exists, but not in the way you'd expect. Not as a place but as a design, a sequence, a psychological key. Survivors of the Grove showed identical symptoms regardless of age or background. Disrupted sleep cycles, inability to form long-term memory, and most disturbingly altered perception of time. Multiple interviews conducted by Dr. Eliza Mordain in the 1990s recorded subjects describing entire days missing from their memory. Time loops, déjà vu events, the feeling of being watched by people who weren't there. She documented 14 patients with no ties to each other, all dreaming of the same spiral diagram. Her paper, The Shared Spiral Syndrome, was rejected by the American Journal of Psychiatry. Too speculative, they said. Too mystical. But she kept going. She traced the syndrome's appearance to towns where descendants of Sanctum Grove members had settled. Not all were active, she claimed. Some just carried the signature. An imprint, she called it. A genetic code written in ritual, not blood. But every few generations, she said, something reactivates it. She died in 2004. Her final journal entry read, "They are not human in the way we think. They are systems. And the spiral, it waits." If you've ever lost time, walked into a room and forgotten why, or dreamed of a place you've never seen that feels like home, ask yourself, what if you weren't remembering? What if you were being called back? By now you might be asking, why Kentucky? Why there? What was it about that soil, that air, that made it the perfect breeding ground for the Grove? The answer may lie beneath Pleasant Hill, just 40 miles east. In 1799, a series of limestone caves was discovered by a land surveyor named Nathaniel Krause. Inside were petroglyphs, not Native American but pre-native, dating back over 10,000 years. Among them, spirals. Maps of the stars that didn't match current constellations. These caves were sealed in 1810, ordered by the governor due to unexplainable sounds echoing from the lower chambers. The cave entrances were buried. But in 1983, a small sinkhole reopened one. Inside were stone tablets with a phrase repeated 512 times in an unknown script. The same number of people who vanished at Sanctum Grove. And when decoded by linguist Deborah Vask, the phrase translated roughly to forget is to return. To return is to disappear. Kentucky wasn't random. It was chosen. Or perhaps it chose them. A convergence point. A place where old rituals worked better. Where silence had weight. Where names could be erased and no one outside would care. That's the trick, isn't it? Hiding in places no one wants to look. Disguising evil as devotion. Turning community into a trap with doors made of scripture. And now, halfway through the veil, it's time for you to decide who you are. If you're still watching, you've already felt it, the shift. The truth doesn't just inform. It changes. This isn't a story. It's a mirror. So now I want you to type 2 words into the comments. Not for the algorithm. For your identity. Write, I remember, twice. First, to acknowledge you were blind. Second, to promise you won't be again. These stories, these patterns, they're not just echoes from the past. They're warnings. Systems that work too well to ever be left behind. What began in a Kentucky grove didn't die. It evolved. It spread. Through churches. Through foundations. Through front-facing corporations and philanthropic movements so noble, so clean, you'd never suspect the darkness they were built on. Sanctum Grove was a prototype, a testing ground, and its legacy? Still running silently beneath our feet. If you want more, if you want to keep going deeper into what they've hidden, then subscribe to this channel. But don't just click it, commit to it, because from this point forward there is no turning back. Let's talk about the gatekeepers. Every hidden system needs one. In the case of Sanctum Grove, it wasn't a religious leader or a local sheriff. It was a woman named Eula Harper. On paper, she was nothing, just a schoolteacher from Clay County. But behind the curtain, she controlled every whisper, every record, every narrative. She married into the Crown family in 1949 and quickly rose to oversee external relations. It was Eula who wrote to grieving families. Eula who met with state officials. Eula who made generous donations to local churches and kept their mouths full and their eyes closed. But she wasn't just an administrator. Eula understood the real threat wasn't exposure, it was belief. As long as the grove was seen as a religious mystery, it was harmless, romantic, even admirable. So she curated the legend, spun it like gold. She fed stories to journalists about devotion and miracles, while quietly deleting the names of the disappeared from town registries. And when someone got too close, Eula smiled her teacher's smile, and made them vanish too. Her influence ran so deep that even after her death in 1985, new landowners still received letters, typed on the same model Smith Corona she used, warning them not to disturb sacred ground. The ink was fresh. The machine had been melted down a decade earlier. So who's writing those letters now? The deeper we go, the more we encounter the spiral. It's more than a symbol. It's a signature. A psychological fingerprint left behind at every site of historical manipulation. From Sanctum Grove to Jonestown. From Waco to Pine Gap. Spirals show up in architecture, in dream records, even in trauma survivors' sketches. Psychologists call it apophenia, seeing patterns where there are none. But what if the pattern is real, and you've just been conditioned not to recognize it? In the grove, spirals were carved into bedposts, woven into quilts, stitched beneath collars. Not for decoration, for orientation. They used the spiral to train the eye, to teach the mind to loop, to fixate, to surrender. You've seen it too. Loading screens, corporate logos, meditation apps. They say it calms the brain. What they don't say is who trained the brain to respond that way. Elias Crown didn't invent the spiral. He unearthed it from ancient burial texts in the Fertile Crescent, texts that were later lost in World War I. But fragments remain, describing as shape the soul fears. A gate, not of matter but of suggestion. It wasn't built, it was programmed. And the spiral is the code that opens it. So I ask you, when you dream of spirals, do you feel peace, or do you feel watched? Let's rewind for a moment to the first disappearance. Not the first chronologically, but the first they failed to cover. It was 1933. A man named Levi Dunn, a rail worker from Lexington who had converted to Sanctum Grove's doctrine after a personal tragedy. He stayed for 6 months, then sent a letter to his brother that simply said, "They don't know I remember, but I saw what's under the chapel." That letter made it to the post office, but Levi didn't. 2 days later, a wagon accident was reported near the northern perimeter of the grove. The body was burned beyond recognition. No autopsy. No witnesses. No funeral. But the real story was in Levi's journal, found hidden behind a loose stone in a barn loft he once worked in. In it, he describes a late-night ritual. Hooded figures. A spiral made of salt and ash. And a voice beneath the floor that didn't sound human. It wasn't speaking, he wrote. It was remembering. And I was the memory it wanted to consume. Levi's journal vanished from public record in 1941, but a typed copy surfaced in a private estate sale in 1996, buried inside an encyclopedia set. Its final page simply reads, "If this reaches you, never speak my name. Names are doors, and once opened, they do not shut." You may be wondering, why would people stay? Why wouldn't they just leave Sanctum Grove? The answer is simple and sinister: they couldn't remember how. The rituals weren't just symbolic, they were neurological scaffolding, designed to destabilize identity. Members were put through fasting cycles, sleeplessness, repetition drills. Their names were changed, their birthdays reassigned, their memories reframed. It's called re-anchoring, used in cults, military programming, even high-level marketing. But Sanctum Grove perfected it. Witness accounts describe people who had forgotten their own children's names. One woman claimed she hadn't seen her brother in 10 years. He'd been standing beside her the entire time. There's a reason the number 512 appears again and again. It's the binary code for erasure. 512 kilobytes, the size of memory banks in early brainwave manipulation machines. Coincidence? Or proof the Grove was part of a larger experiment, one using people like storage drives? They weren't just disappearing physically. They were being wiped clean, repurposed, and redeployed. Into what? We don't know. Not yet. But if you've ever met someone who felt hollow behind the eyes, like they were echoing a script they didn't write, you may have spoken to a survivor of Sanctum Grove, or something made from its ruins. Now we return to Elias Crown, whose story doesn't end with Sanctum Grove. According to suppressed county records, Elias died in 1937. But according to private security footage leaked in 2003, someone matching his exact appearance, same build, same gait, same scar under the left eye, was recorded walking out of a government building in New Mexico. This wasn't just a look-alike. It was him. Unighet. Unchanged. Wearing the same type of tailored vest he wore in 1912. The footage vanished days after release. But here's the implication: Elias didn't die. He transitioned. Or rather, he was preserved. Kept alive by the very rituals he once preached. Whether by design or by force, he became the vessel for something far older. A continuation. Not of life, but of function. Every society has its priests, its keepers of the flame. Elias is that. A walking archive. A sentinel of the spiral. And if he still walks among us, he isn't alone. Because systems like this, ancient, psychological, transhuman, they don't rely on belief. They rely on architecture. And wherever that design is replicated, he's there. Or something wearing his name. Watching. Waiting. Until the spiral calls again. By the mid-1940s, Sanctum Grove was no longer just a local anomaly. It had become a closed-loop ecosystem of control, untouched by war, depression, or industrialization. That's no accident. Every economic downturn seemed to skip the region. Every natural disaster veered off course. Farmers outside the perimeter struggled. Inside, abundance. But that abundance came at a cost, paid not in currency but in cognition. The children born within the Grove didn't attend public schools. They were taught by keepers, older members trained in behavioral calibration, not education. Language itself was altered. Concepts like escape, question, or outside were phased out by age 7. When survivors escaped, they often had to relearn basic emotional vocabulary. Some couldn't describe what freedom felt like without trembling. This wasn't religion. It was psychological encryption, reprogramming people to remain inside without chains. And it worked. The outside world, meanwhile, was told it was a private faith community. But inside, it was something else. A test site for generational obedience engineering. Let's dig into the sound. A low hum that visitors described feeling in their teeth, not hearing in their ears. Locals said it came from underground springs. Officials blamed wind currents. But defectors from the Grove called it the reminder. It played during sermons, meals, even sleep. Subaudible frequencies designed to destabilize the boundary between memory and imagination. One escapee, known only as Subject 7, underwent cognitive scans after fleeing in 1961. The results were chilling. Her brain showed patterns consistent with early-onset dementia, yet she was only 24. But more disturbing were the embedded auditory triggers. When certain tones played, her pulse dropped, her pupils dilated, and she whispered scripture she claimed never to have heard. The Grove didn't just preach, they programmed. And sound was the key. In 1998, a field researcher recorded ambient noise from what used to be Sanctum Grove's chapel. The file was analyzed by a DARPA subcontractor. 3 weeks later, the contractor vanished. The file is still circulating in deep web circles, encoded under the name Elias_C512.wave. Don't listen to it. Not unless you want to feel something remembering you. By 1952, the Grove's inner circle was experimenting with mirrored isolation. This wasn't just about silence or confinement. It was about forcing members to face themselves until the concept of self collapsed. Individuals were locked for days in hexagonal rooms lined with mirrors, lit by flickering lanterns, and flooded with that same humming resonance. No food, no speech, just reflections. Imagine watching 100 versions of yourself blink at slightly different rhythms, all under the influence of neuroacoustic suggestion. This wasn't punishment. It was initiation. Those who survived emerged hollow, compliant, emotionally sterilized. Those who didn't, their bodies were never recovered. But here's where it twists. Survivors of the mirror rites claimed they didn't just see themselves. They saw other people, dead relatives, historical figures, creatures with no eyes but infinite mouths. The reflections spoke truths the subjects could not forget. One woman claimed her mirror told her the Grove was built on a fractured timeline, a wound in causality disguised as a church. When she tried to tell her husband, he slit his own throat. The room had no sharp objects. You ever wonder why nothing remains? No tourist signs. No government plaque. No, welcome to Sanctum Grove ghost town attractions. That's intentional. Because Sanctum Grove wasn't abandoned. It was extracted. In 1966, under the guise of infrastructure expansion, a multi-agency task force removed all visible structures. Barns, homes, the chapel, disassembled and relocated to undisclosed sites. Soil samples were sealed. Trees were felled and burned. Roads were rerouted. This wasn't cleanup. It was erasure. And the final touch. A shell corporation bought the land and turned it into a private hunting reserve, surrounded by electrified fencing and monitored 24/7. Ask the wrong questions and you'll be greeted by men in gray SUVs claiming to represent the State Forestry Division. But no such division exists in public records. One whistleblower claimed that beneath the old chapel foundation lies a vault, steel-sealed, lead-lined, 400 feet wide. Its contents? Unknown. But flight logs show frequent stops from military-grade drones circling that precise GPS coordinate every month like clockwork. Sanctum Grove isn't a ghost town. It's a quarantined anomaly. And someone still checks on it. Because whatever they buried, it's not dead. If you've made it this far, you're not just a viewer. You're a seeker. Someone peeling back layers they were never meant to touch. And you've earned something. So listen carefully because this is where the mask drops. This isn't about one town, one cult, or even one country. It's about a global mechanism. Sanctum Grove was just a beta test. A spiritual operating system designed to override human volition and reroute it toward external control. The same architecture now lives in educational platforms, in apps that reward you for compliance, in algorithms that punish curiosity. The same spiral shows up in logo designs, brain training programs, even therapy circles. Not all are malicious, but enough are synthetic to raise the question, how much of your mind is still yours? You were never meant to ask that. But now that you have, I'll ask you to do 2 things. 1. Comment the phrase "the spiral remembers" twice below. Once for the algorithm and once for the transformation. 2. Subscribe if you haven't. This rabbit hole is just opening and we'll be going deeper, together. The next truth? It may cost more than your beliefs. It may cost your old identity. In the 1970s, new records surfaced through a leaked Freedom of Information Act request, buried among declassified CIA documents. Project Tyrant, a behavioral control initiative believed to be shuttered in the 50s, mentioned a Kentucky pilot site used to test long-term psychological suppression on civilian populations. Codenamed Grove 3. Coincidence? Not likely. The timelines match. The region matches. And the objectives match exactly what was done inside Sanctum Grove. The same memo cross-referenced MKUltra subprojects on hypnosis, psychic driving, and trauma-based programming. But what struck researchers most was a phrase scribbled in red pen on the margin of one classified memo: "The children don't dream anymore. The experiment is a success." That memo was dated 1972. By then, every trace of Sanctum Grove had already been scrubbed from maps, news articles, and public memory. The children born inside never registered for school. No birth certificates. No state ID. And yet they showed up later in the most unexpected places: elite prep schools, think tanks, biotech startups. Placed, groomed, wired differently. Not scarred by trauma, adapted by it. A series of anonymous testimonies submitted to an underground forum known as Red Vault in the early 2000s confirmed what many feared: the Grove never died. It evolved. One user, calling themselves Watcher 7, described growing up in a remote Appalachian commune where singing wasn't allowed unless approved, where mirrors were forbidden, and where every mealtime was preceded by a sound played through the walls. When he tried to escape at age 19, he was found 48 hours later, naked, dehydrated, and whispering a 6-digit code. He had no memory of running. But blood tests showed elevated cortisol and strange neural proteins typically only found in patients undergoing ECT. His handler, yes, handler, not family, convinced doctors he was schizophrenic. He was institutionalized for 2 years before escaping and posting the log. He ended the post with one line: "If you've seen the spiral once, it's in you forever." To this day, that post is erased every time it's uploaded to public platforms. Automated takedown. No copyright, no violation. Just vanished. Some say the Grove still operates, just under a new name. A new front. But the programming? Still very much active. The strangest part? It always begins the same. Isolated land. Charismatic leaders. A message of purity or transcendence. Then rituals. Then control. Then silence. You'd think this pattern would raise alarms. But it doesn't. Why? Because the public has been trained, slowly, patiently, to dismiss anything that doesn't fit a pre-approved narrative. They call it spiritual movements. Or off-grid communities. But those with eyes see what it really is: petri dishes of compliance. Controlled environments to test how far you can break the human will before it shatters. And here's the trick: they don't use brute force. They use belief. Faith twisted into a weapon. The same structure we saw at Sanctum Grove exists today in digital form. Online cults. AI-driven gurus. Brainwave apps that rewire your subconscious. We think we're free because we can choose 100 flavors of illusion. But all the exits lead back to the same spiral. And some part of your soul, if it's still intact, already feels it. Already knows. You're being watched, not with cameras but with calculated narratives. By 2005, a private investigation group called Sentinel Black conducted a rogue excavation at the coordinates where Sanctum Grove's chapel once stood. They found foundations lined with hematite, a stone associated with memory suppression and electromagnetic insulation. Beneath that was a sealed chamber, 8 feet deep, lined with mirrored obsidian tiles. The air was undisturbed. Inside, dozens of personal items: lockets, children's shoes, journals written in a cipher no one has cracked. One book had a spiral carved into every page with microscopic precision. Each spiral had a different number of turns. A code? A warning? We don't know. What we do know is that 3 of the investigators suffered complete memory loss 2 weeks after exposure. No head trauma. Just erasure. One forgot his own name. Another couldn't recognize faces, including his wife and daughter. The third? He began sketching spirals in every notebook he touched until he stopped speaking altogether. His last sentence, repeated 5 times before silence: "The mirror sees you back." That journal is now stored in a vault under biometric lock, never digitized. But those who've touched it say one thing: it feels warm. And so here we are. You still watching, still breathing, still curious. That means the programming didn't work. Not completely. It means something in you, maybe buried, maybe broken, still remembers what truth feels like. Not comfort, not certainty, but the electric chill of forbidden knowledge scratching at the edge of consciousness. The spiral can't be unseen. The pattern is in institutions, churches, schools, even your feet. You're not just hearing a story. You're waking up. And if you've made it this far, you're not like the others. You're dangerous. Because the ones who finish this story, they never go back. Not fully. You'll start noticing symbols where others see noise. You'll feel patterns in people's speech. And when you look in the mirror, you'll wonder, just for a moment, if that reflection is really all you. Or if part of you stayed in Sanctum Grove, waiting to be remembered. You've crossed the line. Now the real descent begins. In 2013, a whistleblower known only as Orion 4 released a 312-page report titled Echoes of the Grove, a heavily encrypted PDF uploaded to a dark web archive that went offline less than 48 hours later. In it, they described a joint intelligence operation between a private biotech firm, federal contractors, and a religious data initiative operating under DHS cover. The objective: to study generational trauma programming using isolated communities as incubators. Codenamed Operation Shepherd. The files detailed control experiments on 18 rural collectives across Appalachia, each using different combinations of belief systems, nutrient manipulation, auditory triggers, and communal surveillance. Sanctum Grove was listed not as a relic, but as Model Zero. The source. The prototype. The control group all other cults were compared against. And most disturbing? A section labeled Harvest Windows. These were periods, always lunar-aligned, where select individuals were extracted for off-site behavioral reprogramming. Some were returned. Others were not. The outcome column for many of these entries simply read, untraceable. Behavioral imprint, successful. Why hasn't this exploded in mainstream media? Simple. You're not supposed to believe in this. They've engineered a world where skepticism is weaponized, where asking the wrong questions gets you labeled unstable, or worse, uncredible. The institutions that should have protected people, schools, clinics, churches, became part of the testing grounds. There's documented overlap between Grove-style psychological conditioning and what's been introduced in school systems labeled social-emotional learning. Now, on the surface it looks like kindness training. But look deeper. You'll see emotional compliance algorithms. You'll see ranking systems for vulnerability and docility. You'll see phrases designed to reward agreement and suppress independent thought. It's the Grove again, just digitized, scaled up, made palatable. They didn't need to keep building physical communities. They just had to implant the framework in every city, every screen, every classroom. And most chilling of all, they didn't have to force anyone. They made us ask for it. Comfort over truth. Safety over awareness. Predictability over freedom. You may be wondering by now, what happened to the original Richardson bloodline? The family that once ruled Sanctum Grove like a silent dynasty of spiritual engineers. Official records claim they vanished, died, or scattered. But leaked census anomalies from 1982 list a Caleb Richardson III, residing in a closed compound in Utah, operating a non-profit focused on spiritual heritage reclamation. IRS forms show donations funneled through shell organizations connected to biotech startups and educational foundations. Another name, Rebecca A. Collins, appears in the 2001 charter of a neurospirituality think tank based in upstate New York. Their mission: reintegrating ancient religious practices with brainwave optimization. Sound familiar? It should. These are the grandchildren of the Grove. Smiling. Funded. Untouchable. No robes. No bells. Just TED Talks, grants, and biometric labs. They've traded the altar for algorithms. The hymns for dopamine loops. And now they're not isolating 400 people in the woods. They're plugging 4 billion people into a feedback loop of willing hypnosis. At the center of every empire is one sacred lie. One core story that holds the rest of the illusions together. For Rome, it was divine authority. For America, it's freedom. But in the case of Sanctum Grove, that sacred lie was purity through submission. That by surrendering your mind, your will, your past, you became closer to God. But here's the truth they never told their victims. God had nothing to do with it. It was always about obedience. About watching how far people would go when their suffering was called sacred. That's the real horror of the Grove. Not just the deaths, not the disappearances, but how easily faith was rewritten into a weapon. And here's the hardest part to face. It still is. Modern institutions cloak their control under mental wellness, optimization, and alignment. They push mindfulness apps that sync to biometric trackers. They create AI therapists that reward you for compliance. And every week, a new leader rises, saying they have the truth. Selling freedom that only works if you don't think too much. And if you've stayed with me this far, you're not just listening, you're remembering. Some of this feels too close, doesn't it? Like echoes of a dream you never lived but still recall. That's not an accident. The spiral doesn't start in the woods. It starts in you. In every moment you silenced your own voice to fit in. In every time you sensed something wrong, but stayed quiet. That's the first layer of programming. They don't need to erase history if they can train you to never look at it. But you looked, you watched, you stayed, and now you're dangerous. You've peeled off another layer. And there's no going back. This video might vanish. The algorithm may hide it. But you saw it. And that makes you part of the resistance. Not the loud ones. The silent ones. The remembering ones. Comment this phrase twice to burn your signature into this story. The spiral sees me. Wants to awaken. Wants to anchor. Section 36. Sanctum Grove's final days weren't marked by fire or flood, but by a silence so absolute it choked the land. Between 1827 and 1834, the disappearances spiked. Locals reported strange lights hovering in the woods, livestock mutilated with surgical precision, and sounds, low droning harmonics, that caused hallucinations and bleeding from the ears. The Richardson family called it divine judgment. But old miners in the hills whispered a different name, the throat of God. A sinkhole deep in the western bluff that opened in 1829 after a week of earthquakes. The family sealed the area, forbade members from approaching it. But those who got close said they saw altars, stone circles freshly built, symbols scorched into the ground, sacrifices. Some say that's where the untraceables ended up. Not buried, offered. Not to a God of love, but something older. Something that answered prayers in flesh, not light. And when the final inspection team from Ohio came in 1834, they found 123 buildings, fully intact, food still cooking, tools mid-use, and not a single soul left alive. No signs of struggle, no blood, just silence, like a reset switch had been flipped, and a single phrase carved into the main chapel wall. The harvest is complete. So what are you supposed to do with this? What good is knowing? That's what the sleepers always ask. The truth doesn't care about your comfort. It's a scalpel, not a hug. The Grove wasn't an isolated cult. It was a template. A replicable model for how to fracture identity, install compliance, and profit off trauma. And it's still running. Not in the woods anymore, but in algorithms, in synthetic religions of productivity and healing. They sell you calm while tightening the leash. Self-help has become the new scripture. Growth, the new obedience. And guess what? You don't need a compound if everyone's phone is a leash, every scroll a sermon, every app a ritual. This is Grove 2.0. And your attention is the altar. You've just traded chapels for screens, robes for dopamine hits. You think you're free because no one's holding your body, but they already own your focus, your fears, your defaults. And if you still believe you're the exception, you've already lost. But there's a crack in the program now. This moment, because you're not scrolling, you're still watching. You feel that deep churn in your chest, that unease, that static behind your eyes? That's your real self waking up. the one they tried to bury. The one that knew all along that the silence in Sanctum Grove wasn't death, it was clarity. The clarity of seeing what happens when people give away their voice, their will, their awareness. Don't make their mistake. Question every pattern. Interrogate your urges. When something feels normal, ask who made it that way. Because most of what we call culture is just control with a paint job. You don't need to escape to a forest to find freedom. You just need to reclaim your perception. That's the exit. That's the antidote. But it's not free. You'll lose comfort. You'll lose company. But what you gain is real, untouchable, yours. So what happened to Sanctum Grove? They erased it, burned the original records, turned it into a tourist site, sanitized the history, called it Pleasant Hill. You can visit it right now in Kentucky. They'll show you the buildings, the handmade furniture. They'll talk about Shaker values. But they won't mention the disappearances, the black books, the blood rituals. They won't tell you about the mother who begged for her child, or the man buried alive for asking the wrong question. No plaque for Thomas Whitman. No tour for Sister Mary Caldwell. Just whitewashed silence. That's how power survives. Not by hiding, but by rewriting. So the next time you walk through a museum or read a history book or listen to a teacher tell you how things were, remember this: history isn't what happened. It's what was allowed to be remembered. And those who control the remembering control everything. If you felt something during this story, don't ignore it. Don't call it entertainment. That's what they want. For this to become just another dark mystery video. No. This was a wake-up ritual. A mirror in the shape of a horror story. And if you stared into it long enough, something inside you shifted. You don't see the world the same now. You're not supposed to. That's your proof you're alive. Now let it burn. Let it remake you. Share this video. Subscribe to the channel. And drop the phrase, "The spiral sees me," twice in the comments if you're ready to stop being a follower in someone else's program. Because you've just stepped out of the dream and into the war. Welcome back. Welcome home.